Which is better for maximum weight loss, walking or running? Every year, millions of people resolve to lose weight, but every year, millions of people gain the weight back. Is that because they did something wrong or because they are lacking in character and willpower? A lot of people believe in the notion of no pain, no gain, that we have to suffer in order to get results. But is that really how it works for weight loss and fat burning? Or is that more of a cultural conditioning that we should be more deserving of success if we suffer first? Well, in this video, you will learn the truth about how it really works so that next time you resolve to lose weight, you can do it once and for all. Coming right up. Hey, I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympic decathlete. And if you want to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. So the idea of losing weight and burning fat based on exercise like walking or running is based on the idea that we have to expend energy, we have to use up energy or calories, and therefore some of that energy is stored as fat, and therefore if we expend more energy, then we would burn the fat. And that makes a lot of sense, but it's not as simple as that. So first, we want to look at where does that energy come from and how is it different if we're walking or running, or is it different? All right, so the two ways that the body makes energy is called oxidative phosphorylation. It's a big word, but it simply means that we're making energy in the presence of oxygen. It means we have enough oxygen supplied that we can send the fuel into something called a mitochondria, and that mitochondria uses oxygen to oxidize the fuel. And this fuel could be fat or glucose. And if we have enough oxygen, then we're going to make fuel, we're going to make energy called ATP. That's just the cellular currency. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's just the currency of energy in the cell. And we can make 38 units of ATP from 1 unit of glucose. And fat is a larger molecule, so we make more than 38 ATP. But that's not really important. The important part is that it's a very efficient way of making energy, and in the presence of oxygen, we can make a lot of it, and all of that oxidation is happening in the mitochondria. So because that is the preferred and the most efficient way for the body to make energy, and because at rest and at moderate levels of exercise, the body prefers to use that, and it prefers to use fat for fuel, at rest for our basal metabolic rate and for low intensity exercise, we use about 85% of the energy from fat and about 15% of it from glucose. But both of those fuel sources are channeled into the mitochondria for the use of oxygen to make ATP. All right? The alternative way of making energy is called glycolysis. And that word means, it's from two parts. It's glucose, glyco means sugar, and lysis means to break apart or split. And that's exactly what it is. So when we don't have oxygen, when oxygen is not available, or when it's not available in sufficient quantities, when we're falling short, then the body relies on glycolysis. It starts splitting sugars, and this does not happen in the mitochondria. This is a separate mechanism. It happens inside the cell, in the cytoplasm, but outside the mitochondria. This is not very efficient at all, and we can only make 2 ATPs from 1 unit of glucose. So when we have oxygen, we can make 19 times more energy than when we don't have oxygen. So what this means is, this is an emergency way of making energy. It's super important for a crisis, such as when we don't have oxygen or when we have to make a sprint, when there's an emergency, when we have to escape from something. Then we have a backup fuel, we have a backup method of making energy, but it's very inefficient. It costs us to make a certain amount of fuel, we have to use up a lot of glucose. 100% of this mechanism of this glycolysis comes from glucose, hence the name. Glycolysis, it's about sugar. It doesn't work for fat. So if you're planning to walk or run in order to burn fat and to lose weight, then we would want to understand, does this happen more during walking or running, or does that happen more? And what's the balance? How does that really work? When can we burn the most fat? Because ultimately that would be the goal. So there's something called aerobic metabolism. That means with air. And we're going to assume that when you're walking, that you're walking at an intensity where you're basically below 120 beats per minute of heart rate. Because at that heart rate, for most people, you're going to be breathing normally. You're not going to be huffing and puffing excessively. You're going to be breathing in and out in deep breaths, but at a steady rate, and you're not going to be huffing and puffing. What that means is you have enough oxygen. When you're not huffing and puffing, you're supplying enough oxygen to provide the mitochondria enough oxygen to stay with the oxidative phosphorylation without needing to get in to start splitting sugar. And because of that, the aerobic metabolism, aerobic exercise, which is all activity when you're less intense than huffing and puffing, you're going to burn the vast majority of your fuel from fat, especially if you're fat adapted. So if you're fat adapted, you're probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% burned from fat and about 15% from glucose. But this is not glycolysis. This glucose is still going into the mitochondria for oxidation. As you increase your intensity, then that percentage, the glucose percentage, is going to go up just a little bit, but not a whole lot, because this is still mostly with oxygen. But as you cross over, as you cross into anaerobic and you start huffing and puffing, now there is no longer enough oxygen to provide the mitochondria with enough substrate, with enough oxygen to maintain this phosphorylation, this oxidative phosphorylation. So we can't rely on this exclusively anymore. So on top of this, the body will start breaking down glucose. It will start with glycolysis. It will start splitting sugar molecules. And again, because this is very inefficient, we're going to start using up a lot of carbohydrate rather quickly. So nothing is ever 0 or 100% in the body. There's always a mix of different pathways and different activities. But we can say for sure that if you are fat adapted and you're doing aerobic, you are in the vast majority of fuel provided from fat. But as you start huffing and puffing, now the glucose becomes dominant. So the intensity is going to determine how dominant it becomes, but pretty much as soon as you're huffing and puffing, you're going to be using more glucose, more carbohydrate than fat. So right here we want to start thinking that a lot of people think that, oh, well, you know, it's just about calories, that no pain, no gain. If I burn more calories, if I run faster, then I burn more fat. But that's not how it works, because you can't burn more fat than you can provide oxygen for. The only way to burn fat is with oxygen. So you can only burn fat up to the aerobic threshold. then you can't do it. That mechanism it doesn't kick out, but it can't increase anymore. We have to add this on top of it. Okay? So then the question is, what happens after that? What are the other effects that we need to understand? Well, one thing we want to keep in mind is how long can you keep this up for? All right? Because you're wanting to burn energy. You're wanting to burn that fat. And if you can keep something up for hours, like you can go for a walk for hours. You can do a leisurely bike ride for hours. You could do some easy rollerblading for hours if you're fit and capable and skilled to do that. But if you're running and huffing and puffing, you can't really keep that up very long. Depending on how fit you are and how fast you go, maybe 20 to 45 minutes if you do it on a regular basis. We're not talking about doing a marathon every day. So if you can go a whole lot longer, then you can burn a whole lot more fat. Again, if you do this, you're going to burn some more calories, but the calories won't be coming from fat because the oxygen sets the limit. So another thing that happens when we go from aerobic, which is a rather leisurely state, into anaerobic, which is a more high-stress state, is we change the perception of the body. We go from a peaceful to an emergency state. We're kicking in an emergency metabolic system, the reserve pathway. So now we're going to start using up glycogen and glucose rather quickly. So think of glucose and glycogen as this little reservoir right here. So some of this can be stored in the muscles for direct use by the muscles. But the glycogen in the muscles cannot come back out of the muscles. It can't re-enter circulation. It can't go back into the liver and become blood sugar for the rest of the body. So when we start using up glucose, it's not just the muscles, but the whole body starts sensing the need for more glucose. And when the body needs more glucose, then other than the muscles, which makes the fuel for the muscles, the only other reserve we have is the liver. And the liver can only store about 400 calories of glycogen, about 100 grams. That's not very much at all. And it doesn't want to blow all that glycogen all at once. So it starts to look for other ways. And the primary way to create more glucose is cortisol. And the cortisol starts telling the liver to convert some of that glycogen, but it also starts looking for other sources in the body, like amino acids and proteins. So anywhere that the body can start to source more substrates, more things that it can turn into glucose, cortisol is going to tell the body to do that. That once we become more dependent, once we start using more carbohydrates, then we start becoming more dependent on carbohydrates. And because the reservoirs, the stores of carbs is called glycogen, they're very limited in the body. And once we start burning through them, the body is going to start looking for more immediately. And one way that it's going to do that is by raising cortisol. So early on, the cortisol is simply going to tell the liver to break down some glycogen to maintain blood sugar because we're going through it faster. The muscles are using most of it and they sort of have their own supply, but other parts of the body are also looking for more glucose now that we're burning through the reserves. So the liver has to break down glycogen to raise blood sugar to supply the body. And now with that higher cortisol, we're also going to increase insulin because once we retrieve the glucose from the liver, we break down glycogen, the glucose gets into the bloodstream. Now we need insulin to get it back from the bloodstream and into the cells that need it. If we stick with the walking, if we stay in aerobic, then we're never going to trigger significant amounts of cortisol. We're going to stay on a low cortisol level. That means that our ability to burn fat and our ability to stay fat adapted is much, much better, right? So if we eat a low carb diet and we teach the body to start burning fat, we're much more likely to stay in that fat adapted state if we don't go in and start burning that emergency fuel. Whereas if we start burning the emergency fuel, now we increase the tendency for carb dependence. So think of this as this little spike here is the little reservoir for glycogen. That's how carbohydrates are stored. Whereas this orange area is our fat reserves. So first of all, we have a whole lot more fat reserves, and that's why we gain weight, and that's what we're trying to get into. That's what we're trying to burn away. And if we're fat adapted, now we have good access to that. The doors are open. Whereas if we're carb dependent, then we're going to burn through this little carb reserve, and then we're going to look for other carbs. We're never really going to get significantly or predominantly into using the fat for fuel. So we'll burn through the carbs, and then because of the cortisol, because we stay carb dependent, now we burned up the stores, we're going to get hungry again. Right? We're going to get cravings because the body says, hey, you know, this is an emergency. We used up the carbs and we're probably going to need more in the future. So let's make sure that we fill up so we keep this topped off for the next time an emergency comes around. Whereas if you're fat adapted, then there's no emergency. You got all this fuel to use up. There is no stress. There's no emergency there. So it's not just about how many calories you burn, it's how many calories are you going to eat. What's your tendency going to be for eating and having cravings afterwards? So with aerobic, you are probably, if you're fat adapted especially, you're probably not going to have any extra hunger. If you were fasting before and you go for a walk, you're probably not going to come back and be ravished. Whereas if you go for a run, if you get into this burning through carbs, then an hour after, you're probably going to be ravenous. And if you watch some of my videos, you know that insulin is the main hormone that we're concerned with. Insulin is released, it's secreted, it's stimulated in response to blood sugar. So when we have high cortisol, when we exercise and trigger cortisol, that's going to raise blood sugar, so we're also going to raise insulin. And insulin, like we've talked a lot about, it is a fat-storing hormone. So after you're done with the exercise, if you eat a bunch of carbs, then you'll be more likely to store those carbs because insulin converts carbs into fat, and it has a tendency to promote the storing of that fat, and it has a tendency to prevent the breakdown and the burning and utilization of that fat. So everything about fat burning and weight loss is about reducing insulin and reducing insulin resistance. And once we shift from fat burning to carb burning, we're also shifting more back into insulin resistance. So aerobic exercise, during aerobic, we are actually almost in pure fat burning. And if we don't trigger a lot of cortisol, we're not going to leave that fat burning. We're going to be in a stable state. We're not going to upset that balance. Now, if we are in anaerobic, then some people might say that, oh, well, all that matters is calories. And I hope we've debunked that enough that you don't think that's primary. But calories in, calories out, the equation still holds true. All right? So while you are running, you will be burning more calories per unit of time. But is that really important? Does that really matter? Well, first of all, you can't keep it up as long. So the total calorie expenditure is probably not higher even though you can get more calorie burning in per minute, so to speak. But because you're triggering the cortisol, because you're triggering the insulin, because you're inhibiting the fat burning, then you are not going to be successful in the long run with that, because you will get more hungry. You will get significantly more hungry. And what's going to happen then is that suppose that you have the willpower to resist those cravings, that you just so immensely strong-willed, that you can just go hungry and just fight through it. Well, you just burned up all your glucose. Your body is going to have to find it somewhere. So if you can force yourself through those cravings, then the body is going to start burning muscle and turn that into glucose, because you basically force the body to replenish the glycogen stores. But if you don't put any glucose in, it's going to have to find it somewhere else. And the main source then is going to be to break down muscles. And that is obviously not what you want. Both of these methods will increase growth hormone. And that's a good thing, because growth hormone is a fat-burning hormone and it is a muscle-building hormone. However, the mechanisms are different, because with anaerobic, with the higher intensity, then it's the challenge, it's the fitness challenge that's going to trigger the growth hormone. However, that growth hormone effect will be more than offset by the cortisol and the insulin and the cravings and the fact that you will have to start breaking down muscle to compensate for the carbs that you burned up. Here, however, you will make growth hormone because you are promoting the fasting, all right? So assuming that when you're fasting, your body starts burning fat, there is a lack of protein, and you all get into a fat-burning state. If you're doing keto, then that fat-burning state will be even more intensified. But the principle of fasting increasing growth hormone is strongly accentuated by exercise. So aerobic exercise and fasting are sort of building on the same principle, that you need to generate fuel without adding any fuel to the body. So here, the exercise is adding to the growth hormone without unbalancing anything else. Whereas here, you're making the growth hormone, but you're offsetting it because you burned up the carbs, you made your body carb dependent. Now you're going to break down muscle, you're going to increase the cortisol and the insulin and have a tendency to store more fat. So there's a lot of mechanisms, but in this state, because you're not stressing the body, everything is sort of flowing. It's working with the body, it's working on the body's terms of harmony. Whereas here, when you're stressing it, now you have to provide the carbs. And then once you provide the carbs, now you can't really burn the fuel anymore. You just keep burning up and refilling that glycogen store. So between walking versus running for maximum weight loss, the clear winner is walking. However, does that mean that you should never run again, or that no one should ever run, or that walking is the only type of exercise you should do? Of course not. That's not how it works. So, who can run? What type of person would it be suitable for to run? Well, someone who is fit, pretty much regardless of age. I mean, most people are probably going to be younger if they're fit and lean. But if you're 60 or 70 and you're fit and lean, then you could probably still do some running. You also want to be insulin sensitive, meaning your body knows how to process fat and carbohydrates. And if you do a little bit of running and you tap into your emergency fuel, you're not going to upset or the balance too much or stress the body too much. If you enjoy running, if you enjoy being fit. So if you're fit first of all, and then you want to maintain that or promote that fitness. And if you enjoy some variety, just like doing different things, then go for a run once in a while. But don't think that you'll be healthier the more you run, or that you burn more fat the more you run, okay? You still want to do most of your activity aerobically. And I've also done some videos on exercise where I talk more about not just the aerobic and the anaerobic, but the high intensity interval training, how that works and how much to do of each of those. Then who should walk? Well, if you are already overweight, then that means that you are pretty much insulin resistant and you are not super fit. Then these people you've kind of broken your metabolism. Your body isn't ready for the type of stress that this imposes. And if you impose this stress, then you will hinder your body from recovering from that insulin resistance. You'll hinder your body from smoothly and steadily staying in that fat burning state. And if your primary interest also is just health, then walking is better for most people. So there are many, many different reasons to exercise in different ways, but if you're overweight and insulin resistance and you're trying to lose weight and burn fat, then walking is the clear winner. So remember that if you're trying to lose the weight once and for all, which I'm assuming that has to be the case for everybody, then it's all about reducing insulin resistance. And if you do that, then you get a nice bonus of also dramatically reducing your risk of high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease and stroke and dementia. How about that for a bonus? If you enjoyed this video, make sure that you look at that one as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.